In Update 1.101 Rating Fire, Gaijin added the USS Northampton into War Thunder. Put simply, it's a worse version of the USS Portland. Same firepower, less AA, less survivability, and similar mobility. Rather than reviewing the USS Northampton in the context of War Thunder, I want to talk about the ship in a historical sense, going over the history of the Northampton class's development, the strengths and flaws of the design, and the individual histories of each ship of the class. First, to understand the design of American heavy cruisers, it's important to understand the American fleet's doctrine and the intended use of cruisers. With World War I's focus on a battle line of capital ships as the primary fighting force, cruisers were mainly used as scouts, convoy raiders, and convoy escorts. Due to this, America required that their cruisers have a high top speed along with supporting scouting aircraft. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 limited cruiser armament to a maximum of 8-inch cannons, along with limiting their displacement to a maximum of 10,000 tons. 8-inch guns provided maximum range, striking power, and penetration, making them a natural fit for the American fleet's doctrine. During World War II, the role of heavy cruisers gradually shifted towards escorting carriers and providing shore bombardment, which they were naturally suited towards given their high speed, potent anti-air armaments, and powerful 8-inch guns. It's also important to understand the ships that came before and after the Northampton to see what the design attempted to fix and what flaws in its design needed to be changed. I'll be covering the Pensacola, Northampton, and Portland classes. Later classes like the New Orleans, Wichita, Baltimore, and Des Moines will be left for future videos. The heavy cruiser class that came directly before the Northampton was the Pensacola. The Pensacola Class was America's first cruiser designed after the Washington Naval Treaty and made with saving weight in mind due to the treaty limits on maximum displacement. The weapon layout chosen was to place 10 8-inch guns into 4 mounts, with 2 superfiring up front and 2 superfiring aft, or an ABS-XSY layout. The top mounts contained 3 guns, while the bottom mounts contained 2. The Pensacola class initially had 4 5-inch 25 caliber cannons and 2 triple torpedo launchers as secondary weapons. However, the torpedo launchers were replaced with 4 more 5-inch cannons before they ever saw combat. The top speed of the Pensacola class was 32.5 knots, or 60 kilometers per hour. 2 catapults for seaplanes were placed amidships, but had no hangar present for the seaplanes. Seaworthiness of the Pensacola class was also poor due to their low freeboard and flush deck, along with a high top weight due to their large masts and high center of mass. The ships also had a relatively short length of 585 feet and 6 inches. The designers of the Pensacola also overestimated the final weight of the design, causing the final displacement to come in at 9,100 tons when the goal had been closer to the treaty limit of 10,000 tons. The focus on firepower and mobility was quite obvious from the design, as protection on the Pensacola was very poor. The main belt of the Pensacola was 3 inches thick, and the deck was 1 inch thick. The frontal magazines had 4 inches of belt armor and 1.75 inches of deck armor, with no armor covering the aft magazines. The gun mounts weren't actually considered turrets due to their incredibly thin 2.5 inch face armor, and are actually referred to as gun houses instead. 2 ships of the Pensacola class were built, USS Pensacola and USS Salt Lake City. Directly after the Pensacola class had its design finalized, work began on a successor class which would become the Northampton. The goals for this class are to increase seaworthiness, improve seaplane operations, and improve protection of the ship. The most notable change between the classes is the turret layout of the Northampton. Rather than 10 guns split into 4 turrets, the Northampton has 9 guns split evenly into 3 turrets, with 2 superfiring up front and 1 placed aft, or an ABS-X layout. This gun layout was successful and was repeated on every following American heavy cruiser. The Northampton also had 4 5-inch 25 caliber cannons and 2 triple torpedo launchers as secondary weaponry. However, the torpedo launchers were replaced by 4 more 5-inch cannons before they ever saw combat, just like what had happened on the Pensacola. The top speed of the Northampton remained the same at 32.5 knots or 60 kilometers per hour. The Northampton kept the same layout of 2 catapults for seaplanes amidships. However, this time a dedicated seaplane hangar was added to better protect the planes and hold up to 4 aircraft. Seaworthiness of the Northampton class was improved by raising the freeboard, adding a raised forecastle, and adding 14 feet to the length of the ship to bring it to an overall 600 foot and 3-inch length. This still wasn't enough, however, and bilge keels were fitted to the Northampton class ships after their construction. The design of the Northampton once again underestimated the total weight of the finished ships, causing it to come in at around 9,000 tons. The overall armor protection of the Northampton was quite similar to the Pensacola. The belt placed over the machinery was still 3 inches, and the deck remained 1 inch thick. The magazines had 3.75 inches of belt armor and an improved 2 inches of deck armor, with both fore and aft magazines being equally covered this time. The gun mounts were also still 2.5 inches thick, maintaining their status as gun houses and not actual turrets. 6 ships of the Northampton class were built: USS Northampton, USS Chester, USS Louisville, USS Chicago, USS Houston, and USS Augusta. Because the Northampton class was designed before the Pensacola class had even begun its trials, some of the issues in the previous designs were not yet noticed and were repeated in the Northampton. Both of these designs were criticized for their very poor protection, being labeled tinclads. The protection of the Pensacola and Northampton only made up 6% of the total design weight. For reference, Japan's first-generation heavy cruiser, the Miyako class, had roughly 16% of its total design weight dedicated to protection. Both the Pensacola and Northampton classes also had very notable stability issues. In response, the Navy began modifications on 2 ships in the next group of Northamptons that were being constructed, labeling them as the Portland class. The Portland class maintained the same armament and top speed of the Northampton class, but featured vastly improved protection and seaworthiness improvements. The design was lengthened by 10 feet, along with having a smaller foremast and mainmast. These changes reduced the top heaviness of the Portland class, leading to substantially better stability than the Northampton class. The final displacement was about 10,250 tons. The main belt remained at 3 inches thick over the machinery, but the deck armor was greatly increased, going from 1 inch to 2.5 inches. Magazine protection was increased to 5.75 inches for the belt and 2.125 inches for the deck. 2 ships of the Portland class were built: USS Portland and USS Indianapolis. The Portland was a much more stable and well-armored design than the preceding Northampton, however it was still a modification of a relatively flawed design. These issues would only truly be resolved with the New Orleans class. However, I'll save coverage of that class and the following heavy cruisers for another video. Overall, the first generation of American heavy treaty cruisers are seen as flawed designs. Out of this first generation of 10 heavy cruisers, 6 of them were Northampton class vessels. Their armor protection and stability were subpar. However, this didn't necessarily make the ships worthless once World War II began. While flawed, they certainly did their fair share of work in the war. For that, I'm going to let my friend Thomas, a fellow naval history enthusiast, take over and explain the service histories of the 6 vessels of the Northampton class.
When looking back at a piece of military hardware, be it a ship class, an aircraft, or an armored vehicle, it's easy to come to conclusions either for or against them purely from looking at the technical flaws and features alone. While it's certainly good to know these things, however, it's often much more revealing to dive into how they performed and to judge their merit based off of what they did or didn't do in practice. The Northampton class of heavy cruisers is one such piece of hardware. Between 1928 and 1931, 6 vessels of the Northampton class were commissioned into the U.S. Navy. These ships in order of completion were christened as Northampton, Chester, Louisville, Chicago, Houston, and Augusta. As with most of the American treaty cruisers, these ships saw extensive service from the very onset of the war. 3 ships of the class were sunk, while the other 3 survived to be scrapped, which on the surface gives the class a rather mixed performance. However, as we'll soon see, it's doubtful as to whether or not their design actually played any major role in this. By 1941, Northampton, Chester, and Chicago had been among the first ships in the Navy to receive the early CXAM search radar. At the onset of the war, 5 of the 6 vessels were operating in the Pacific, with Augusta being the sole member of the class to operate in the Atlantic. During the early months of the war, these 5 saw much service alongside carrier task forces and convoys, with the exception of Houston. Houston was assigned as the flagship of the Asiatic Fleet, and as such found herself acting as a bulwark against the Japanese rampage through the Pacific following Pearl Harbor. Houston was the first ship of the class to be lost. After being bombed in February, Houston took part in the Battle of the Java Sea, where by a miracle she managed to escape. Less than a month later, the damaged cruiser was ambushed at night in the Sunda Strait by a vastly superior Japanese cruiser force. She and the Australian light cruiser Perth were surrounded and sunk after a relentless pounding from Japanese shellfire and torpedoes, although it should be noted that Houston did not go down without putting up a fight. After the early carrier battles of 1942 and the Battle of Midway, the class's next major assignment in the Pacific was the Guadalcanal campaign. At the Battle of Savo Island, Chicago was the sole American cruiser to survive an ambush by a Japanese cruiser force. though not without taking a torpedo to the bow that required several months of repair. Next to drop out was Chester, which was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine in October but managed to limp home for repairs as well. November saw the second loss in the class. Northampton herself took part in the disastrous night battle off Tassafaronga, in which she was struck by 2 torpedoes that crippled her and eventually forced the crew to abandon ship. Despite this, it's notable that very few of her crew were lost during her eventual sinking. Upon returning to the fight, Chicago would be the third and final ship of the class to fall. At the Battle of Rennell Island in January of 1943, Chicago found herself as the target of several concentrated attacks from Japanese torpedo bombers. After taking 2 hits, Louisville attempted to tow her to safety, but the following day 4 more hits were scored on her that eliminated all hope of saving the ship. This left Louisville and Chester as the only ships of the class in the Pacific. After major overhauls in 1943, the 2 cruisers both operated alongside carrier task forces and in support of several amphibious invasions across the Pacific, including operations in the Aleutian Islands. In 1944, Louisville participated in the Battle of the Surigao Strait, emerging unscathed. In early 1945, Louisville was struck by 2 kamikazes in the Lingayen Gulf, which necessitated a return to the States for repair. In the meantime, Chester participated in the invasion of Iwo Jima before returning to the States herself for overhaul. Louisville returned in June to take part in the Okinawa campaign, where she was struck by yet another kamikaze. She remained on station for several days before returning to the States for more repairs. Neither she or Chester saw any more action before the end of the war in August. Augusta lived a charmed life in the Atlantic. In early 1942, she escorted convoys and served as the transport for President Roosevelt, and continued this lifestyle until later that year. Serving as the American flagship during Operation Torch, Augusta engaged Vichy French vessels that attempted to interfere, as well as providing fire support for the troops ashore. She was at one point engaged by the battleship Jean Bart, though the cruiser escaped the engagement without suffering any damage. Resuming her escort duties in the wake of the successful landings in North Africa, Augusta continued to serve in this manner until June of 1944. During the Normandy landings, the cruiser once again provided artillery support by shelling German positions. Though she was targeted by bombers, she was not hit and carried out her duties without issue throughout June and July. In August, she provided support for the landings in southern France, shelling more enemy positions while once again escaping damage. The rest of her career was spent training, overhauling, and transporting VIPs, which included King George VI, President Roosevelt, President Truman, and General Eisenhower. All 3 of the surviving cruisers were decommissioned in 1946, then later sold for scrap in 1959. While it's easy to look at the loss of half of the class as an indication of a failed design, it should be noted that the level of punishment absorbed by these ships would likely have sunk any cruiser of the era. Furthermore, it should be noted that the other 3 ships of the class each gave a stellar performance, despite very present flaws in their designs. As such, while one may not necessarily be able to label the Northampton class as a brilliant success, their active service histories and accomplishments allow them to comfortably escape being classified as total failures either. Simply put, they may not have been the best, but they did their jobs, and they did them to the best of their abilities.
I hope everyone enjoyed this video, as I'd absolutely love to make more overviews on the history of ship classes and their development. If you did enjoy, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more, or give me some ideas for what class's development and history I should cover next.